In the vast silence of history, there are names that refuse to fade, and among them, one echoes louder than the rest: Napoleon Bonaparte. A man who once shaped the destiny of continents, now reduced to the quiet pulse of memory. His story, filled with triumph and tragedy, does not end on the battlefield, but in isolation, in the slow unraveling of a once mighty soul. Before we journey into the twilight of his life, if you find meaning in stories of fallen empires, of human endurance and the frailty behind greatness, then subscribe and join this endless voyage through the forgotten hours of history. Because what we uncover here is not just about a man. It's about what remains when the dream of power finally dies. Napoleon's last chapter begins far from the noise of Europe, in the suffocating stillness of Saint Helena. The island is small, damp, and unforgiving, a fragment of rock in the middle of an endless ocean. Here, the emperor who once ruled half the world lives surrounded by guards, storms, and ghosts of his own past. Each day feels longer than the one before. Time itself becomes an enemy he cannot outmaneuver. He wakes early, his body frail, his mind still sharp. The pain in his stomach grows, but he hides it behind dignity. He writes, dictates, remembers. His words are his final army, defending him from being forgotten. Each sentence he utters carries the echo of battles long gone, of men who once shouted his name across the fields of Europe. But now, his voice trembles, softer with each passing day. He remembers Austerlitz, the golden sunrise over victory. He remembers Moscow, the snow swallowing his army whole. He remembers Josephine, her laughter, her tears, her absence. Memory becomes his world, and within that world, he is both emperor and prisoner. He replays decisions, wonders where fate turned against him, questions the loyalty of those he once trusted. Every thought feels like a wound reopening. Days pass without distinction. Letters arrive rarely, and when they do, they bring no comfort. The island is an ocean of loneliness. The men who serve him try to keep his spirits alive. They read to him, they speak of France. But he knows the truth. The world has moved on. The empire has become legend, and legends are not meant to live in flesh and pain. Still, he clings to a kind of hope, not for freedom but for remembrance. He believes that history will one day see him as more than a conqueror, more than an exile. He sees himself as destiny's child, misunderstood, betrayed, but eternal. And in the quiet hours of the night, when the wind howls outside and sleep will not come, he speaks softly to himself, as if convincing the universe that his life had meaning beyond crowns and battles. The pain grows worse. His doctors disagree. Some say it is the stomach. Others whisper of poison. He listens, indifferent, knowing that the cause matters less than the ending itself. What matters is that he endures with dignity, as he did in defeat, as he did in victory. Even in agony, he insists on control. Every gesture, every word, carries the pride of an emperor who refuses to bend. He often thinks of France, the streets of Paris, the faces of soldiers, the weight of the crown he once wore. He wonders what they say of him now. Do they curse his name, or do they whisper it with longing? The answer never comes, but the question stays, endless, echoing through his fading mind. And yet, the human spirit resists disappearance. In his final reflections, Napoleon becomes a philosopher more than a general. He speaks of fate, of greatness, of how power isolates those who seek it. He admits regret, but never surrender. His words drift between confession and prophecy, as if he already knows that centuries later, people will still speak his name with awe and debate. The island does not change, but he does. His strength fades, his world narrows, his sight dims, yet his inner fire remains untouched. In those last moments of lucidity, he seems almost serene, as though he has accepted that this exile is not punishment, but transformation. That even in defeat, he has achieved what few ever could, immortality through memory. And the days go on. The rain continues. The ocean breathes the same cold rhythm. His companions grow older, his footsteps slower, his voice quieter. But the story never truly ends. It stretches beyond his final breath, beyond the grave on Saint Helena, into the endless corridors of history where his name still marches forward. Because the story of Napoleon's last days is not merely about death. It is about the persistence of legacy, the loneliness of greatness, and the eternal struggle between ambition and peace. And as long as there are those who remember, the emperor does not sleep. He waits, in words, in memory, in silence, for the next listener to return, and to hear his story once more. And so we continue. We keep walking through the mist of those forgotten days, one step deeper into the final exile of Napoleon Bonaparte, a journey without end. The days on Saint Helena passed without seasons. The island existed in a perpetual state of gray, a mixture of drizzle, wind, and melancholy. The sun appeared only as a ghost behind clouds, as though even the heavens refused to grant warmth to the man who once commanded all of Europe. The air smelled of damp earth and salt, and every gust of wind carried whispers of the faraway world he would never see again. Napoleon spent hours by the window, watching the mist crawl across the hills. He measured time not by hours, but by memories. The way light once glinted on a sword, the sound of drums echoing across a battlefield, the distant roar of soldiers shouting "Vive l'Empereur." Each recollection was both a comfort and a punishment. Glory was a burden now, not a crown. His household around him lived in quiet obedience. Montholon, Bertrand, Gourgaud, loyal in their own imperfect ways, tried to ease his solitude, but the atmosphere in Longwood House was heavy, almost sacred. Conversations were whispered. Every cough, every sigh carried meaning. The emperor's moods shifted like the wind. Calm and reflective one day, furious and resentful the next. His pride was unbroken, even when his strength was fading. Meals became rituals of memory. He spoke of Parisian cuisine, of banquets that had once dazzled kings. Yet in front of him now lay simple, tasteless food prepared by reluctant hands. Sometimes he refused to eat. Other times he would eat too little and drink too much, lost in thought. Every bite seemed to remind him of the empire he had devoured, and that, in the end, had devoured him. At night, his sleep was restless. He dreamed of marching columns, of white horses galloping through smoke, of cannon fire fading into silence. He would wake suddenly, calling out names. Names of soldiers long dead, marshals long forgotten, friends long betrayed. Then silence again, only the sound of his own labored breathing and the slow rhythm of the rain. But beyond the pain, there were moments of strange peace. He began to speak of destiny, not as something to be conquered, but as something to be understood. He said that power was an illusion, that the true test of a man was how he faced the loss of everything he once thought eternal. His words were softer now, his tone almost tender. He no longer sought victory. He sought meaning. He dictated his memoirs with precision. Every date, every battle, every decision, rewritten not as history, but as confession. He wanted the world to know his version of the truth. He wanted his name to outlive the lies of those who defeated him. His pen became his final weapon, his ink the blood of memory. The British governor, Hudson Lowe, kept him under constant restriction, inspecting letters, limiting visitors, questioning even the smallest requests. Napoleon despised him, not for his cruelty, but for his pettiness. To Napoleon, Lowe was the embodiment of mediocrity triumphant, a man of small soul who believed he was guarding greatness. Their encounters were cold, their words sharp, but beneath it all lay the silent truth. Both men were prisoners, each trapped in a role history had assigned. As months turned into years, his body weakened further. The once imperial posture began to stoop. His steps grew slower, his breath shallower. Yet even as his strength faded, his mind refused to surrender. He would speak of Caesar and Alexander, comparing their ends to his own, noting how every conqueror eventually faced the same enemy, time. He said that empires fall because men believe themselves larger than destiny. There were days when he would sit in silence for hours, staring at a small portrait of his son, the King of Rome. He would trace the edges with his fingers, as if by touch alone he could feel the pulse of the life he had left behind. His greatest regret was not defeat, but distance. the distance from those he loved, from the nation that had once adored him, from the idea of France itself. And still, the world beyond Saint Helena kept moving. Revolutions rose and fell, thrones changed hands, and yet, on that lonely rock, Napoleon lived as if time had forgotten him. The newspapers that arrived months late brought him faint echoes of the world he had shaped, a world that now seemed almost mythic. He would read them, smile faintly, and say, "They are still chasing shadows I created." Each passing week blurred the boundary between life and legend. His attendants began to speak in whispers of his condition, but he never allowed pity. When pain overwhelmed him, he would simply close his eyes and murmur, "An emperor must die standing." He began to believe that death itself was not an end but a coronation, the final act of sovereignty over one's fate. And so he prepared for it, not with fear, but with ceremony. He ordered his will to be written, his few possessions arranged, his thoughts immortalized in ink. He dictated every word with care, as if scripting the conclusion to a grand performance that could never truly end. And yet, even as his body betrayed him, his mind continued to wander, to Elba, to Paris, to the battlefields where destiny had once obeyed his command. He would speak of snow, of smoke, of victory, of ruin. He would repeat old phrases, half in dream, half in defiance. It was as if history itself refused to let him go, looping endlessly within him, an emperor reliving his empire in fragments of memory. And so the story continues. It stretches beyond the walls of Longwood, beyond the grave that would soon hold him, into the infinite space where memory and myth intertwine. Napoleon does not die here. He lingers in the hearts of men who still debate his name, in the minds of those who wonder whether greatness is a blessing or a curse. And as the island fades into mist, one truth remains unbroken. The final days of Napoleon are not an ending, but a mirror, reflecting all the sorrow, glory, pride, and loneliness that define the human soul. And so we continue. We go deeper still, into the endless echo of his thoughts. The exile never ends. The emperor still speaks. He began to sense that his body was no longer his own. The pain that once came in waves now lived inside him permanently, a dull fire that refused to fade. Each morning felt heavier than the last. Yet somewhere in that pain, there was pride. He would say quietly, almost to himself, that suffering was the final test of greatness, that even in exile, even in decay, a true ruler must not ask for mercy. His attendants noticed the change. His once commanding tone had softened, replaced by a quieter rhythm, still firm, but edged with reflection. They could see that the emperor was fading, but none dared to speak it aloud. To them, he was not a dying man. He was the living embodiment of a vanished empire. They addressed him as sire, bowed before him, and carried out his commands, even when his strength could barely lift a pen. And yet, behind their obedience lay fear, not of him, but of the moment when he would no longer be there. For each of them, Napoleon had become both master and meaning. To lose him would be to lose the purpose that exile itself had granted. So they clung to routine, the morning reports, the short walks, the readings of classical histories. Every act repeated day after day, as though by preserving habit, they could hold back time itself. Napoleon would sometimes smile at this. He saw their devotion, their quiet anxiety, and he understood it too well. He had built his entire life on the idea that men needed direction, a star to follow. And now, even on this forsaken island, he remained that star. Not by power, but by memory. His presence alone shaped the air they breathed. He often spoke of destiny in abstract terms. Fate, he once said, is like a mountain. You climb because you must, not because the summit promises peace. He no longer believed in victory. He believed in endurance, in the idea that every man, no matter how mighty, must face his own exile, his own solitude. Sometimes he spoke of the past not as memory but as if it were still happening. He would describe battles with perfect clarity, naming regiments, recalling the movement of each division. He would pause, then look into the distance as though he were still standing in the smoke of cannon fire. For him, time was no longer linear. The past and present had merged into one endless moment, a battlefield without end, where glory and regret coexisted. In those long, heavy afternoons, when rain drowned the horizon and silence filled the house, he would dictate letters to imaginary recipients, to his son, to the French people, to history itself. "Do not pity me," he would say. "I am not a man to be pitied. The world may forget my victories, but it will never forget that I tried to change it." He became more contemplative with each passing month. The harshness that once defined him softened into wisdom, the certainty of command giving way to the calm of understanding. He spoke of how ambition isolates the soul, how the thirst for greatness burns brighter than love, and how even emperors are prisoners of their own dreams. He sometimes asked to hear stories from his servants, small, ordinary tales of life beyond the island, a fisherman's routine, a family's laughter, the sound of bells in a distant church. He listened quietly, his eyes unfocused, as if trying to imagine a world that no longer needed him. For the first time in years, he seemed curious not about history or power, but about the simplicity of ordinary lives. Perhaps he envied them, and yet, even in humility, his pride lingered. He still refused to let anyone see him falter. When his hand trembled, he hid it. When his voice weakened, he forced it steady. To his final breath, he was the emperor. He knew that the world would remember him not as a man, but as a symbol, and he wanted that symbol to remain unbroken. At times, his attendants would hear him murmuring in the dark. They thought he prayed, but his words were fragments. Pieces of old commands, names of cities, the rhythm of distant marches. It was as if the empire still moved within him, an echo that refused silence. Outside, the island remained unchanged. The same wind, the same sea, the same restless mist. And yet something invisible was happening. A transformation not of the man, but of his legacy. Even before death claimed him, stories began to spread across the world. Sailors carried rumors that the emperor was dying, and with each retelling, the story grew, of his loneliness, his suffering, his dignity in defeat. The legend was already being born, shaping itself out of the silence that surrounded him. Napoleon himself seemed to sense it. "They will make of me what they need," he once whispered. "A hero, a tyrant, a ghost. But I will be theirs forever." There was no arrogance in his voice, only acceptance. The quiet realization that history had already begun to write without him. And so the final days continued, endless in their sameness, each one blending into the next like waves upon the shore. There was no grand finale, no dramatic farewell, only the slow fading of breath, the deepening of silence, and the eternal continuation of a story too vast to ever truly end. Because even as his body weakened, his presence grew stronger. Not here, not now, but everywhere memory could reach. He was no longer merely Napoleon the man. He was Napoleon the myth, Napoleon the lesson, Napoleon the warning. And still we continue, through memory, through reflection, through the echo of footsteps that never stop. His exile endures, his voice endures, and in the long corridors of history, he still walks, unseen, unforgotten, unending. In the final weeks, the house at Longwood grew quieter still. The footsteps of servants softened. Conversations fell to whispers. Every sound seemed to carry weight, as if the air itself understood that history was holding its breath. The emperor slept longer now, drifting between fever and half-conscious memory. He spoke less, but when he did, his words felt deliberate, heavy, as though each one were meant to be his last. Those who attended him noticed how his mind wandered. He would stare into empty space and speak of things unseen. Distant cities, forgotten faces, voices calling from the past. At times he spoke to Josephine, as though she stood beside him. At others, he gave orders to invisible generals, commanding legions that existed only in his fading memory. No one interrupted. They listened in silence, afraid to break the spell of those final illusions. The pain in his body had become constant, but he endured it with the same restraint he had shown on the field of battle. "It is nothing," he would say, even as his strength drained away. To him, suffering was a duty. To show weakness would be to betray the image of the emperor, and he would not allow it, not even now, when the empire existed only in his mind. There were days when the weather turned violent, and the wind howled across the island. The roof groaned, the windows shook, and the men who watched over him spoke of omens. But inside that small room, the emperor lay unmoved, his breathing shallow but steady. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that had raged within him for years. Ambition, loss, and pride all colliding in endless turmoil. Sometimes he asked for readings from his favorite books, from Plutarch, from Caesar's commentaries, from Homer's Iliad. His voice would tremble as he repeated the lines that had once inspired him to greatness. He said that all heroes meet the same end, abandoned by time, remembered by legend. Perhaps that thought comforted him. Perhaps it made the silence bearable. His companions began to record every word he spoke, every expression, every moment of lucidity. They knew that soon he would be gone, and they wanted the world to know what it was like, how he spoke, how he thought, how he faced the end. They wanted to capture not just his death, but the idea of his death, the transformation of man into myth. And as the days stretched on, even the island seemed to grow solemn. The wind quieted, the waves softened, the sky hung low and pale, as if veiled in mourning. Everything slowed, as though nature itself was preparing to witness the passing of something larger than life. When the fever grew worse, Napoleon asked to see his few loyal followers. He looked at them one by one, men who had followed him through fire and exile, who had seen him at both his highest and lowest. He thanked them not with grandeur, but with quiet sincerity. There were no speeches, no declarations, only a few simple words. France will remember. He then turned his gaze toward a small portrait of his son, and for a long time he said nothing. Those who stood beside him could see tears forming, not of weakness, but of something deeper, the sorrow of a man who had conquered everything except his own destiny. In the final hours, he drifted between sleep and memory. His breathing slowed. He whispered fragments of phrases. Army, France, Josephine. The words faded into silence. For a moment, he opened his eyes as if to look beyond the room, beyond the island, beyond the world itself. And then, stillness. There was no sound but the slow rustle of the curtains and the distant murmur of the sea. Those around him bowed their heads. No trumpet, no cannon, no anthem marked the moment. Only silence, the kind that belongs not to death but to history. And yet, even as his body cooled, something else began to awaken. The men who had served him began to speak in hushed tones of what they had seen, of his composure, his courage, his final words. Outside, the guards who once watched him as a prisoner now looked upon his chamber with reverence. The conqueror was gone, but his presence lingered, vast, unexplainable, unending. Across the sea in France, the news would take months to arrive. But when it did, it would travel like fire. People would weep, argue, and remember. Some would curse his name. Others would raise it to the heavens. Songs would be written. Myths would take shape. The man who had ruled nations now ruled memory itself. And still, even now, his story does not rest. It moves like the ocean, eternal, shifting, refusing silence. Every generation rediscovers him, questions him, reshapes him. Was he a hero or a tyrant? A genius or a monster? The answer changes with time, but the fascination remains. Because in Napoleon's end lies something universal, the truth that even the greatest must face their own fragility. And so, his exile continues not on an island, but in the collective imagination of mankind. His footsteps echo in the corridors of history. His voice murmurs in the pages of books. His shadow falls across every discussion of power and ambition. The emperor sleeps, but the legend walks. And the legend never stops. We continue still through centuries, through memory, through the endless retelling of his fall and his rise, his glory and his grief. The waves still strike the rocks of Saint Helena, and each one seems to whisper his name. Napoleon, a man who wanted the world and who, in the end, became its story. The death did not close the story. It merely changed its shape. On the island, his body rested, but beyond the sea, his name began to rise again. The soldiers who had once marched under his banners spoke of him in taverns and camps. They remembered the warmth of his glance, the certainty of his orders, the way he could make ordinary men feel like the architects of destiny. Their stories spread faster than ships could sail. The world that had exiled him now began, quietly, to miss him. In France, memories awakened like embers long buried. The people who had once cheered, then cursed, now spoke of him with a strange tenderness. For all his wars, he had given them pride. For all his ambition, he had given them a dream. And dreams are not easily forgotten. In secret, painters sketched his image, poets whispered his name, and children played games in which one of them always shouted, "I am Napoleon!" The legend had escaped the grave. Years passed. Empires shifted again. Kings came and went, but his shadow remained. The new rulers tried to erase him from the nation's heart. Yet the more they tried, the deeper his story sank into the soil of France. His exile became a symbol of greatness misunderstood, of courage punished, of the endless struggle between a man and the destiny that made him. Even the island that had imprisoned him began to change. Visitors came from distant lands to stand before the small tomb marked only by a stone and the silence of trees. They described a stillness unlike any other, as if the air itself carried memory. Some said they could feel him there, not as a ghost, but as a force, the same will that had once moved armies now lingering in the wind that circled Saint Helena. 2 decades later, when the French government asked for his body to be returned, it felt less like a political act and more like a homecoming long delayed. The ship that bore him back across the Atlantic moved slowly, draped in black, followed by silence and salt spray. Those who watched from the shore said that the sea itself seemed calm, as though paying respect to the man who had once dreamed of conquering it. In Paris, crowds gathered long before dawn. Old veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with young students, all waiting for the first sight of the imperial coffin. When it appeared, carried through the streets, no order could keep the people quiet. The cries of "Vive l'Empereur" rolled like thunder between the walls. For a single moment, France remembered what it felt like to believe. The ceremony at the Invalides was not an ending either. Beneath the golden dome, his remains were laid in a tomb carved from red stone, but above it, the legend grew brighter. Scholars argued over his genius, philosophers examined his fall, artists tried to capture the light in his eyes. Every generation reshaped him. A hero for some, a warning for others, but none could ignore him. And so the centuries turned. The world that Napoleon once commanded changed beyond recognition, yet his presence remained stitched into its fabric. His strategies were studied in academies, his laws endured in civil codes, his image appeared on monuments and coins. Even those who condemned him could not escape the fascination. His story was too vast, too human, too alive to be buried. Perhaps that is why the legend feels endless, because within it lives every contradiction of mankind: ambition and humility, cruelty and vision, the hunger for greatness and the price it demands. Napoleon's life was not a single tale but the mirror of all human striving. The years kept moving, and with them the meaning of his name began to shift again. What had once been a memory of battle became a language of ambition. The young looked to him not as a soldier, but as proof that one life, if driven far enough, could bend the world. In every academy of war, his maneuvers were drawn on chalkboards. In every parliament, his laws were quoted as the foundation of order. Even those who spoke against him carried his influence in the words they used. Writers returned to his story, each finding a different Napoleon within it. Some saw the dreamer who reached too high, others the tyrant who mistook his will for destiny. Painters filled entire galleries with his face, sometimes crowned, sometimes broken, sometimes lost in thought before a map. Composers wrote slow marches and requiems that echoed the rhythm of his life. The steady rise, the sudden fall, the long silence after. In the quiet corners of France, the myth lived more gently. Grandfathers told children of the little corporal, the soldier who rose from nothing. They did not speak of empire or blood, only of courage and belief. Those stories became folklore, the kind that seeps into a people's soul and stays. The emperor became not just a man of history, but a pattern of hope. And yet the world that followed him could not escape his shadow. Each new ruler, each new revolution was measured against his name. Europe rebuilt itself, but its borders still carried the marks of his campaigns. The modern world, its laws, its roads, its idea of merit, still bore his fingerprints. Even in the far corners of the globe, in nations he had never seen, his legend arrived as a symbol of the restless human will. Scholars tried to separate the man from the myth. They examined every document, every letter, every wound. But the closer they looked, the less certain they became. Was the emperor truly cruel, or simply a reflection of his age? Was he visionary, or only pragmatic? History offered no single answer. It only deepened the mystery. Perhaps that is why he endures, because he cannot be fully explained. Time, which erases so much, could not erase him. Instead, it polished his memory until it gleamed like stone touched by centuries of hands. The monuments raised in his honor aged, cracked, and were restored again, each generation leaving its trace. Pilgrims still walked the aisles of the Invalides in silence, standing before the tomb that held not a body, but an idea too large to die. Outside, Paris grew louder, faster, brighter. Empires fell and rose again. The world entered new wars, discovered new machines, reached for the sky and the stars. But through it all, the image of a man in a gray coat and bicorn hat still appeared. In books, in dreams, in the imagination of those who wondered how far a single mind could go. And somewhere beyond that endless fascination lies the quiet truth, that even the mightiest story begins and ends with the same small things. A breath, a thought, a heartbeat. Napoleon's legend has grown vast, but it remains built on the same human longing that once drove him from Corsica to the throne. The wish to be seen, to be remembered, to give shape to the world before time dissolves it. The centuries do not silence him. They transform him. He becomes less a conqueror and more a question of what greatness truly means and what it costs. His life, stretched across history, invites every age to answer it again. And so, the story of Napoleon does not truly end. It only fades, like the final note of a song that lingers long after the music stops. From the thrones of Europe to the lonely rocks of Saint Helena, his journey was more than the rise and fall of an emperor. It was the story of what it means to dream without limits, and to pay the price for it. He conquered continents, but in the end, it was time that conquered him. Yet even time, that relentless ruler, could not erase his name. It lives in the whispers of history, in the pages of books, in the hearts of those who still look toward the horizon and wonder how far a single man can go. Perhaps that is why we still speak his name. Not for the battles, not for the crowns, but for the flame that burned inside him, the flame that refuses to die. Because in the end, Napoleon Bonaparte was not merely a man. He was a mirror, reflecting the endless struggle between ambition and fate, power and solitude, glory and loss. And as long as humanity hungers for greatness, his story will walk beside us. Unchanging, unending, eternal. The sea still carries his memory. The winds still whisper his name. And somewhere, beyond time and history, Napoleon still stands, watching, waiting, as the world continues to chase the dream he once dared to live.